Hello, this is Jean McKnight. I am on the Needham Planning Board, and I serve as co-chair of the Housing Plan Working Group, which is sponsoring this community workshop. This is not actually a formal meeting of the Housing Plan Working Group, but I do want to introduce the members of the working group. We've been busy with this project since October of 2021. And I think we're not all here yet, but let me introduce the members that I see, and perhaps you'll just say here or wave so that others will know who you are. My co-chair is Natasha Espada.
Here.
And Emily Cooper.
Here.
Helen.
Inside for recess, so Rachel about, I don't know.
Helen Gregory.
Here.
Dan Matthews.
Here.
Longtime member of our select board, of course. And I should have said, with regard to Helen Gregory, that Helen is on the Council on Aging. And a few of us are citizens at large. Emily Cooper, who I introduced, is on the Housing Plan Working Group as a citizen at large. And then also a citizen at large is Oscar Mertz.
Hi.
And joining us, I see Marcus Nelson, also a member of our select board and a member of this Housing Plan Working Group. And Ed Scheidler. Ed serves on our Needham Housing Authority and is a member of the Housing Plan Working Group. Now, the other member who I thought would be here joining us is Rhonda Spector.
I'm here.
And oh, there you are, Rhonda. Good. And Ed Cosgrove. No, I get it. I guess Ed hasn't joined us yet. So the Needham Planning Board is sponsoring the preparation of a housing plan to present current data on demographic shifts and housing conditions in order to identify priority local housing needs to guide decision-making on the town's future housing agenda. To undertake this work, the planning board appointed the housing group that I introduced. And as I said, their group is composed of representatives of various local boards and committees with a few at-large community members. And our town has not had an approved housing plan since 2007, although it's made considerable progress in producing affordable housing since then, adding 894 new state-approved multifamily units to its subsidized housing inventory, of which 238 are affordable to those with incomes at or below 80% of the area median income. So that the town has surpassed the state affordability goal of 10% under Chapter 40B. Despite reaching this threshold, the town recognizes that significant unmet housing needs remain, particularly in the context of our unprecedented housing prices. Consequently, the town is revisiting its housing agenda by obtaining updated documentation on the local housing dynamic, preparing a housing plan to strategically address identified priority housing needs. This effort now has greater urgency to enable the town to respond to the newly enacted amendments to the State Zoning Act, requiring MBTA communities to zone for more multifamily housing. And the active engagement of local leaders, housing stakeholders, and residents is a key component of this planning process. The Housing Plan Working Group held a public education and listening session on January 27th to obtain early community input into this planning effort. Our written comments were received following the listening session, and we continue and will continue to review and consider comments emailed to planning@needhamma.gov. This community housing workshop tonight is meant to offer basic information from a draft housing needs assessment and get more feedback from the community on town housing challenges, goals, and priority actions. Now, I missed a step, I must say. After I introduced the members of the Housing Plan Working Group, I'm meant to introduce our town staff working on this project. So let me do that now. Lee Newman is our planning director.
Present.
Alex Klee is our assistant town manager, and Alex is assisting with technical support for this program.
Assistant Town Planner, hi.
And Karen Soonerboard, well, let me back up a bit and introduce Karen last, because Cindy Gonzalez has also been very helpful in this process, and Cindy is our public information coordinator. And let me introduce now Karen Soonerboard, who is our town's community housing specialist. And Karen will be making a PowerPoint presentation with highlights from the housing needs assessment. And after that, Karen will open the breakout rooms for us. Karen Soonerboard.
Thanks, Jean. You know, we've been planning this event for a long time and looking forward to it. And it's nice that it's finally arrived, and thank you all for participating. As Jean mentioned, I'm going to try to just go through the key takeaways of a draft housing needs assessment, which is the first major component of the housing plan that we're preparing. It's a pretty detailed and comprehensive document that really analyzes demographic shifts as well as housing conditions to get us to a point of really prioritizing housing needs. So I'm going to try to move through the presentation very expeditiously because we really want to get to the focus of the meeting, which is to hear from you. Let me mention that some of the initial slides were included in the presentation at the January 27th public education listening session. So those folks who might have attended that, just bear with us. We're going to get to some new material and really want you to hear that. Because of our ambitious agenda, we're going to hold any comments or suggestions. And if you want to provide some input on the draft housing needs assessment or suggestions, please contact us through planning@needhamma.gov. So with that, let's just start with the first slide, Alex. So there are numbers of definitions of affordable housing, and this can be confusing. The HUD definition, which has been embraced largely by the state, is that if you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing costs, whether for rental or ownership, you're living in housing that isn't affordable to you. The definition that we hear mostly about is that which is included under Chapter 40B Comprehensive Permit Law, which means that in order for a unit to be considered affordable by the state as part of what's called a subsidized housing inventory that that inventory of units that counts towards that 10% affordability threshold under 40B, it has to meet a number of requirements. First, it has to be available to households earning at or below 80% of area median income. And we're talking about the whole Boston area, can actually include some towns in New Hampshire, goes west to Framingham, even goes down to a couple of coastal communities. So it's a broad area. An example would be for a household of 3, the 80% level is $90,950. The unit has to be subsidized either directly by some public funding, or it has to be approved through a subsidizing state agency, which is required to give, in the case of a comprehensive permit application, for example, the developer has to get the go-ahead from a subsidizing agency before he or she can apply to the local zoning board of appeals for a comprehensive permit. The units have to be, very importantly, deed restricted. And we're talking about maintaining affordability requirements to the greatest extent possible in perpetuity. They also have to be affirmatively marketed, that and the state's pretty prescriptive on this, that there has to be a real effort to notify people who live outside the community of the affordable housing opportunity and have the ability to apply. There are some other definitions, phrases that we hear about that relate to affordable housing. One is community housing. And this generally refers to units with that are targeted those with incomes up to 100% of area median income that are eligible for funding under the Community Preservation Act, CPA. Workforce housing is also something that we hear about, and generally is oriented to units that are for people who work in the community, but are don't necessarily qualify for at the 80% level, but it's still shut out of the private housing market. And the percentages vary. Some towns are 110, sometimes 120. There are actually several units in Needham that are up to 150% AMI. And then there's a market affordable housing, which is kind of includes moderately priced non-SHI units that still serve a pressing local need, but are available on the local housing market. And next slide. This table just shows the range of income limits. This is the area median income limits based on certain tiers. They're adjusted by household size and they're adjusted annually by HUD. In fact, we're expecting the 2022 income limits any moment now. I mean, they're usually released at this time of the year. But once again, an example for a household of 3, which is the average household size in Needham, it ranges from a 36,250 limit at the 30% extremely low income limit up to 90,950 at the 80% level. And if you're talking about community housing at the 100% AMI level, it's $108,720. Next slide. So this slide focuses on what housing the state currently counts as affordable in Needham. And we have been relying on the 2010 year-round housing figure of 11,047 units. And based on that figure, the 1,410 units that are included in the SHI represent 12.7% of the housing stock. So that's the town has surpassed the 10% affordability goal under Chapter 40B and is no longer susceptible to zoning overrides through comprehensive permit applications. Now, the developer and the town have to agree on terms and conditions if a comprehensive permit is going to be used. And the comprehensive permit process can be a very good permitting tool. And that's 12.7% shows real progress from example 3.94% in 2006, and 7.6% in 2015. I should mention that the housing needs assessment, there are some 2020 census figures that had been released that were included in the draft housing needs assessment. They were released for congressional redistricting purposes. And we'll go through some slides that have those figures. We needed to rely on the 2019 census estimates. However, the 2020 census estimates finally arrived, and we just received them, and we'll be updating the needs assessment with those figures in the coming weeks. So we estimated that the census would bring the percentage of affordable units down to 12%. It turned out that this year's figures, they cited as 0 seasonal or occasional units that would typically be subtracted from the total housing figure to get the year-round figure, the denominator for the SHI. So we're using the total 2020 housing unit count of 11,891 units, which would then bring the percentage of affordability down to 11.9%, still a good cushion for above that 10% level. Other information on the SHI, the Needham Housing Authority manages 316 units, which is a very important inventory for the town of Needham, as it really targets those very deeply affordable units. SHI includes 17 ownership units, or 1.2% of all of the SHI units. Also, it's worth noting that all units in Chapter 40B rental projects count as part of the SHI, and thus the SHI does include some market units. This was created by the state as an incentive for communities to build multifamily rentals that included affordable housing. The SHI includes 660 market rental units, in fact, or 47% of the 40B projects, compared to 742 actually affordable ones, or 53%. And it's worth noting that these new rentals really help diversify the housing stock, as single-family homes have really been so predominant in the community. And also 40Bs require that 25% of the units be targeted to those with incomes at or below 80% of AMI, or 20% of units need to be targeted at the 50% AMI level. Next slide. So this is just some 2020 information on demographic shifts. So the 2020 census counted 32,091 residents, which represented an 11.1% increase since 2010, which is significant, particularly in comparison to the 7.4% increase statewide and the relatively flat population that the town had experienced in the decades before. The population 18 years of age or older had a growth rate of 14% versus the population 18 years and under with a 3.7% increase. Population of non-white residents has increased significantly from 5% in 2000 to 9% in 2010, and now up to 15% in 2020. Additionally, those claiming Hispanic or Latino heritage include 1,223 residents, representing 3.8% of the population. Next slide is some information on housing from the 2020 census. It counted 11,891 housing units, and that represented an increase of 769 units, or 6.9% from 2010, which is pretty comparable to the 6.8% housing growth statewide. However, the higher population growth of 11.1% to the 6.9% housing growth demonstrates some increasing household size. It's worth noting that with building permit information, we found that 98% of new single-family permitting between 2010 and 2020 involved tear-down activity. And that housing growth was largely fueled by some of the larger 40B developments, including 526 units that were created through the Kendrick and the Monera Needham developments. Next. So as we are all aware, housing costs have been increasing. The median single-family house value was $1.3 million as of September 2021, based on banker and tradesman information. And the figure as of the end of 2021 is pretty much the same. And this is up significantly from 1,170,000 as of the end of 2020. Market rents are also high. For example, in the Chapter 40B developments, the range was $2,600 to $4,200 rentals. In the market units at Charles River Landing, the range of $2,200 to $5,000 at the Kendrick. The 1 and 2 bedroom units at the Monera Needham starting at $3,200 and $3,600 respectively. Even units in older buildings were renting at high amounts. For example, at least $1,900. And that $1,900 rent would require an income of approximately $84,000 if you are assuming that the tenant's not paying any more than 30% of their income on rent, and then some inclusion of utility costs. And that $84,000 is far, far higher than the $41,691 median income of renters in Needham. And 24% of all households were experiencing cost burdens as they were spending more than 30% of income on housing costs. And of those, 11% had severe cost burdens. They were spending more than half their income on housing. And those cost burdens increased to 60% with cost burdens and 38% with severe cost burdens for those who with incomes at or below 80% of area median income. Next slide. So with rising costs, it's not surprising that there are widening affordability gaps. We're looking at an affordability gap of $534,000 based on the difference between the median price single family home of $1.3 million and what a median income earning Needham household earning at $165,547 could afford, or $766,000. And this is up significantly from $211,500 based on our calculations in 2014. At the 80% AMI limit, this is once again for a household of 3, the gap increases to $928,500. Once again, the difference between $1.3 million and in this case, what a household earning at that limit could afford of $371,500 based on a number of assumptions. And this is up from $556,500 in 2014. Next slide. So this chart just shows the changes in median house prices for Needham as well as neighboring communities, with the first orange column being the median single family home price in 2005, which was kind of the highest point in the market for most communities before the recession. The next one, the rust color in the middle, involves the median house price in 2010, when we were still kind of in the recession. And the right column includes the median as of September 21. And you see for all communities, there was they suffered some loss of value with the recession, but rebounded significantly since then. With Wellesley at a median at $1,658,000. Next slide. So the housing needs assessment provides an analysis of various indicators of housing need, and through various considerations, prioritize them. Deliberations will continue when we get more information from the community, as well as having discussions with the working group as well. But this involves kind of considerations for rental housing being a significant priority, as it targets the needs of the most financially vulnerable residents, promotes greater housing diversity, as 84% of Needham's housing stock is owner occupied, 82% in single family detached homes. Rentals also leverage local investment, as almost all state and federal subsidies are oriented to rental development, family rentals in particular. Can we respond to kind of denser and scale development with new state guidelines for MBTA communities oriented towards multifamily housing, provide opportunities for mixed income housing, including financing for lower income tiers through a number of state subsidy programs, provide support for greater numbers of residents over time as rentals turn over more frequently, enhance the ability to qualify households for housing subsidies given state asset limit requirements. And all units in affordable development qualify for inclusion on the SHI. And an interest in maintaining town's position above 10% level. Next slide. So this slide looks at indicators of need that suggest that rental housing is the greatest local housing priority. About 27% of renters had incomes of less than $25,000. Renter households with incomes at or below 80% AMI have increased. The median income earning renter at $41,691 could afford a rent of about $870, which is incredibly challenging to find in Needham currently. 41% of renter households had cost burdens, 25% with severe cost burdens. 60% of renters with incomes at or below 80% AMI had cost burdens, 38% with severe cost burdens. A particular concern are the lower income earning renters, including 450 renter households with incomes at or below 30% AMI, 48% with severe cost burdens. Of the 580 renter households with incomes between 31% and 80% AMI, 31% had severe cost burdens. None of the households in the 51 to 80% AMI range had severe cost burdens. They had cost burdens, but not severe cost burdens. High rents and upfront cash requirements are required, and low vacancy rate of 1.3%, which suggests extremely tight market conditions. Next slide. And this slide starts breaking out the indicators of need for rental housing based on specific populations, starting with seniors, which we had experienced a recent population growth of those older adults and significant projected growth. Comprise about 900 households, or half of all renter households. They have high cost burdens. About 60% of elderly renter households, and these are elderly in this case defined at 62 years of age or older, 60% had cost burdens, 45% with severe cost burdens. Those seniors that need to rely primarily on Social Security have incomes that fall far below what is needed to afford market rents or even Chapter 40B rents. There are long waits for subsidized housing, and high costs are associated with existing assisted living options such as those at North Hill or Wingate market units. Next slide. And then some indicators of need for families. 37% of small family renter households with incomes at or below 80% AMI had cost burdens. The Housing Authority has 559 applicants on wait list for their 90 family units that include units at Captain Robert Cook and High Rock. There was a decrease in large family renters from 65 in 2011, all with severe cost burdens, to 25. It's likely that with rising rents, many had been forced out of the community. The teardown activity and conversion to owner occupancy has probably also kind of put large family renters in a position of struggling to remain in the community. In regard to single non-elderly individuals, 63% or 235 such households had incomes at or below 80% AMI. 81% of these households had cost burdens, 55% with severe cost burdens. 81% of these households had incomes at or below 50% AMI, and many were potentially relying on Social Security disability income, and therefore were likely looking not only for affordable units, but accessible ones as well. Next slide. Nevertheless, we were certainly clear to point out that home ownership is also something that's needed in the community and should be a priority as they provide starter housing for families who are shut out of the current housing market, potential units for those with incomes in the 80% to 100% range, still eligible for CPA assistance, but priced out of the housing market. Offer more affordable housing alternatives to empty nesters who want to downsize. And home modifications and elevator access in multifamily dwellings are important for this population. They lend greater stability to neighborhoods as owners are perceived as more rooted with less turnover. Enable children who are raised in the community to return and raise their own families in Needham. Provide a preferred housing option for municipal employees and other local workers. Offer some limited buildup of equity, but just for some consideration, the development must rely on internal subsidies where the market units cross-subsidize the affordable ones and or CPA to fill the affordability gaps. Next slide. Just offering some indicators of need for home ownership options. For example, there are only 17 units or 1% of the town's SHI that involve home ownership. There are only 8 single-family homes and 147 condominium units that were estimated to potentially be affordable to the 1,060 households with incomes at or below 80% AMI. And that was relying on assessors data that probably actually underestimates values and situations. Probably there are fewer units than were included here that are actually affordable. High affordability gaps, as we have mentioned, of the 1,060 owners with incomes at or below 80% AMI, 2/3 had cost burdens and 46% had severe cost burdens. So the populations with incomes under 80% AMI, there are real cost burdens under both rental and ownership. And the need to maintain some population diversity by attracting young families. Once again, also extremely low vacancy rate, only 1%, which is, only, only by, well, once again, representing extremely tight market conditions. Next slide. Getting down to the finish line here, close to we also identified the need for units that serve special needs populations and provide services for handicap accessibility. The combinations for these populations are also based on indicators of need, including almost 2,000 residents claimed a disability, including 40%, 6% of those 65 years of age or older. Limited inventory of barrier-free units, growing senior population, that there are barriers to aging in place. And in fact, the Council on Aging and Department of Public Health did a study a few years ago that reported on housing and transit options for seniors, and really kind of tried to really identify some of the barriers to aging in place related to housing in the community. Market rate assisted living units are expensive. SHI includes 118 units in group facilities. However, that is insufficient to meet the need, given the numbers of those with disability. And there are very limited housing options available for disabled young adults who grew up in Needham and are kind of growing out of their schooling. We heard this from a couple of people who participated in the listening session that we had in January. Next slide. So we are going to be breaking into small groups, and we're going to be hearing from all of you about responses to a range of questions concerning Needham housing goals and priorities. Each group has an assigned facilitator from the Housing Plan Working Group, and we'll also need to identify a recorder to keep track of comments, and particularly the priority actions at the end that will be presented to the full group when we reassemble after the breakout sessions.
So I'm charged to get all the different groups. We have 20 minutes to kind of go through each different group to talk about the 6 priorities. And so because I don't know who the group moderator, I mean, not the moderator, the recorder is, I'm going to go with Rhonda, who recorded ours. And then I'll see everybody raise your hand if you're the recorder, and we'll go one by one.
Okay. Our group was very interesting, and it was a great conversation. Our 6 items, and anybody can jump in if I'm getting them a little bit wrong, is to focus on the Needham Housing Authority was our number 1, was making sure that we provided lots of support and encouragement for renovations and increased density for Needham Housing Authority. A lot of people were very focused on the MBTA law and taking advantage of the zoning requirements of that, and then encouraging the group to not.
Can everyone mute for a second, just because we're hearing people typing?
Thank you. And we were, the idea for ours was to not do the minimum, to make sure that we took advantage of that zoning and encouraged more multifamily housing. Lots of ideas about zoning changes. We wanted to look at single family zoning and see if there were areas that could be multifamily. And also there was a great concern for relief for group homes for people who are aging out and wanted to live independently of their parents with disabilities. So maybe I guess one of the focuses was that one of the issues is that there are adults that are unrelated. There's a maximum number of kids that can live together, or people that can live together in a house. So that to somehow come up with some relief for that, so that there could be homes that would have some assistance and group living. wanted to focus on some senior housing and some maybe keeping seniors in homes with some tax relief, and also coming up with some senior living that was maybe some smaller units that people could afford. I think that's what that one was, Natasha. I'm not sure that I got that one quite right. Reducing knockdowns. Some ideas were moratoriums or transfer fees, and that would also the fees would be able to be used for additional subsidized housing. And the last one was to encourage additional tax credit projects that would provide fully affordable housing in the town. So that's what our group came
Perfect,
up with.
Rhonda. And so let's go to the second group. I see Artie Crocker has his hand up, so I assume he's the recorder.
Yes. You're muted, Artie.
Yep.
Okay, got it. Sorry about that. Okay. So yeah, what we have is, yeah, without question, the items we have is the Needham Housing Authority essentially capital plan renovation, additional units. That was one of our top 6. We are talking about the increased density in multifamily zones near the train stations. Obviously, that's something related to the MBTA proposal or plans that are coming down the line. We were talking about the downtown zoning to, in this case, I phrase it downtown at basically vertical housing. We've zoned for that possibility, but it's not happening at this moment. So what can we focus on there to get that vertical housing? There was some mention about taking up green space. And so if we go vertical, we're not taking away more green space. So that there was a little comment about that. ADUs were certainly mentioned. We had talked about trying to find a way to preserve some single family residences. Basically, that boils down to what can we do to reduce tear downs? And there was a comment towards the end. It's basically, it falls under wealth building, increased home ownership, so families can build wealth over time versus just always renting. That's where that's what we got for a list of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's what we had for a list of 6 right now.
Right. It's interesting to see the overlaps and then some other new ideas. So I see John Rufo with group number 3. I'm just naming them just to make sure we don't miss any.
Yep. Okay, so we had a lot of those same things, especially around zoning and around the idea of taking advantage of the MBTA communities piece. What we tended to prioritize was the zoning, but we coupled that with education. We talked about education a lot and the idea of allowing, or it's almost a kind of not a marketing campaign, but a public information campaign to make sure that people understand what scenarios look like when these potential higher density things happen, and also just educating people about what's in it for them. So without repeating the things that other people have already said so far in their reporting, we talked a lot about education, and then along with that, setting clear goals over a 10-year period that can be established and worked towards, so that we likened it to coming out of a meeting with an action list. So setting clear goals seemed to be a really important part of it. I think, but a lot of it had to do with removing the stigma of affordable housing and getting people to understand that the community is actually stronger and better with it rather than somehow devalued with it. And then other things that we talked about as far as actions was the potential of transfer and impact fees related to tear downs, creating bold projects that can aggregate a number of lots together to assemble land to create a large amount of impact. And I think those are the thing. I don't know if I hit 6 there exactly, but those were the ones that seem to be left on the list that maybe hadn't been talked about as much yet.
Great. Thank you, John. I think that brought up a couple of other things. One thing that we talked about briefly was also getting the need, since you mentioned it, really doing a good needs assessment and data collection to really understand who is in need. And it's kind of just information and then to be able to communicate it. Okay, so we have 3 of the groups we had 6 groups, so I know that we're missing 3. So
So I facilitated one and
Emily,
Kate
perfect.
was gonna take notes, but I was scribbling a lot. So, and she's not on camera. I don't want to put her on spot. So I actually probably failed in my facilitating because we did not prioritize. And I think we came up with 6, but we didn't stick to that in particular. So I pretty much all the things I'm hearing in different levels. So the first was really about creating more housing options, that we just had a lot of the same. And we needed to have more options for people in different sorts of situations, and really to do that through zoning, to look at the zoning. We heard that it wasn't that the thing was being torn down, but we should look at what replaces it. Is it, can we replace it with a triple decker versus a single family home? So to really look at the zoning would really allow for there to be more supply. There was a lot of conversation about what was palatable, I think, there. And then there was some conversation of maybe bringing in some agencies that create housing in other communities and saying, why aren't you coming to Needham? Like, what are the challenges? Is it parking? We think it's parking minimums, but is it really parking minimums? Sort of when you look around and you see that there are other, tax credit buildings in other communities, why not Needham? So that would be 1. 2, like other places, we see the MBTA and the transit-oriented development as really an opportunity to move to move the community and to make it a little bit more palatable, because it's something we're choosing to do, but it's really not so much local decision making. It's really like, hey, this is an opportunity. We're going to take advantage of it, and it will move us in a certain direction. To think about whether or not there's a way to include some low income units within whatever gets created as part of that. Like other groups, Needham Housing Authority, we're all eager to hear about their capital plans and support them in renovating what they have and making it better, and then also building more. So we want to keep that train moving. 4, I think there was a question about town-owned land, regardless of which arm of the town owns it. And having a really comprehensive inventory of that, and thinking through revisiting what the barriers might be to using those lands for other purposes. So there was some conversation about, well, there might be use restrictions or deed restrictions or things that you need to do with the state. Are those, insurmountable barriers, or can we look at those plots of land and see if we can incentivize some housing development there? ADUs, there was a conversation about broadening the ADUs to allow for some other groups for long-term rentals. And then I think lastly, but not because it was, and then we did talk about, it's interesting to hear about the group homes. We did talk about people with disabilities who've been raised here, who want to go out on their own, but it's very hard to find a rental apartment for them to live in the community that they grew up in. The last thing, not because it's last at all, but because it kind of goes across everything, which is to build all of this sustainable. That we don't want to be having this conversation again in 20 years because the next version of Needham Housing Authority is falling apart. Well, maybe it's not 20 years, maybe it's more like 60, but regardless. So I hope I did justice to everything. Everybody, David's not, okay, good.
Good, that's great.
And I was the facilitator of Group 4, and I want to admit that I didn't move quickly enough through it to leave us enough time to really get the 6 priorities organized. But Mark Osborne is our recorder, and I think he certainly was listening to what was said, and I turned to Mark.
Great, thank you. Just wanted to, compliment all the people on the group. A lot of great discussion. We were not able to move quite through, as Jean mentioned, to get to everything. But I think some of the things we did talk about which were not already mentioned, were to really focus on identifying specific parts of the town, pieces of land even, that would be targets for development. And how do we use town funds or structure things in a way to encourage the right kind of development? Because as one of the group members mentioned, there is there's a record of having more permissible zoning, yet the development does not occur. So it's not enough just to zone it. You need to actually work with people who want to build what we're looking to build. There was also, complement to that is, what kind of incentives can we create as a town to build more affordable housing by developers, which I think we've heard earlier. And also to keep an eye on the mix of people, right? We want economic, racial, and complementary diversity within the town. And how can we encourage that through our work? So those are some of the areas that I recorded. And Jean and other members of the group, if I missed something, please chime in.
That's great. Thank you so much. This is so inspiring to hear all the different groups and the synergies and other ideas that are coming out of this. So I'm missing one group, and I don't know. I see Oscar from, yes, group number 6.
So Oscar was our leader. I was our recording person, and I'll try to be quick because I know we're running low on time. We did get through prioritization. We had 6 priorities. 2 of them were sort of the top 2, and then the next 4 were sort of all together. Remove restrictions on accessory dwelling units, ease zoning and permitting requirements for energy efficient or environmentally sustainable housing developments. Those were sort of the top 2 that most people agreed on. And then there was 4 that had substantial support, but not entire support. Allow 2-family or 3-family units by right throughout town, provide additional town-funded transportation options to reduce car usage, support scatter site, affordable single and 2-family developments, and waive application fees for affordable housing where appropriate.
Wow, you got straight to the point to end this well. So I think that's great. Thank you so much. And I think now, Lee, you're going to kind of tell us about next steps. And one of the questions that Nadine asked within our group was, how are we, and you were there when she asked it, is how are we going to use this information? So just to kind of give an overview of next steps and how we're going to use this and and when are we meeting again as a large group?
So the next task of following our workshop tonight, I think, is to get the full group's input and preference on the strategies that were presented tonight by the individual breakout groups. Had we been meeting live, we would have asked all of you to vote on the strategies presented so that we could kind of discern where the commonality was in terms of supported goals. But since we're not meeting live and we can't really facilitate that well, we're going to ask you to participate in a poll where we're going to summarize the strategies that were identified tonight and ask you to vote your priority assignment to them. To help us facilitate that, we'd like to have the recorders from each of the breakout groups email us the strategies that you identified from your notes. This doesn't, we don't want to make this a complicated project for you. Just take a picture of the sheets that you filled out and have you email them to us at planning@needhamma.gov within the next couple of days. And our plan then is to put together a list that we're going to ask you to vote on so we can better understand what the common priorities are that are coming out of this particular workshop. I think the next steps for the working group, we're planning to take the information that we got tonight and do a town-wide community housing survey to gather some additional information in terms of how the communities, where the community sees its goals. And respondents to that town-wide survey will be asked to weigh in on their preferences with respect to strategies and to provide any additional comments they want to make to the working group. And so the goal of this next step is to kind of reach a broader audience beyond the folks that participated in this workshop. Over the summer months, I think the working group plans to take the information that we got from the workshop and the information that we're getting from this community housing survey I just described to prepare what I'll call as an action plan, which will summarize, I think, the key long-term and short-term strategies the town has identified to promote greater housing diversity. And this information will then be put into a document that will be presented at a subsequent community meeting that I think we're planning for September, to which we hope you all will attend, and which we will hope to also get your impact or your input and your feedback on. And then based upon that final workshop or that community meeting actually planned for September, the final plan will be developed and finalized, which will include the strategies that the town wants to pursue, timelines for their implementation, next steps, resources that are required to implement them, as well as the entities that should be assigned to move them along.
So thank you, Lee. That was great. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but please, for those who recorded the information from the 6 groups, please send them over to Lee. And on behalf of Jean and I, as my fellow co-chair and all of the staff for the planning for Needham Planning and the town, we thank you for participating. I don't know, Jean, if you have any other concluding thoughts, and thank you to Karen as well.
I wonder if each of the recorders might somehow be connected with the facilitator for that particular group in sending over the notes. In the facilitator and the recorder might help each other with that. If that makes sense, maybe, Lee, that's something that can be facilitated because we do have email addresses.
Great suggestion. Great suggestion.
Could
Well,
I
I see some nods, so.
Yes.
May I understand what that,
I see Artie.
may I
Hands up.
understand what that, may I understand what that means? Because, I mean, for example, on myself, I just have a file, a Word file I've typed, and I was just going to send it to the planning
But
board.
anybody who doesn't, I guess I would say, put it this way. Anyone who feels their notes are all set, ready to go to Lee, no need for any further process. Anyone who feels that they need a consultation with the facilitator in order to pull it together should be facilitated. Why don't we leave it at that? Okay.
Sounds good.
Well said.
Well, thank you, everyone, and good night. And we look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks.